Hello, everybody. This is your host, Young Brando, live from Los Angeles. Tonight, we are back with another episode from our series, RAAR. It is references and auction results, and we are going to specifically focus on Arnold Schwarzenegger's watches. And to even home in on something more specific, I decided to limit myself to the pieces that were made in collaboration with Audemars Piguet and the governor. And there are some very important pieces, of course, quite vital to the mainstreaming of the brand, quite important for the recent history of Audemars Piguet, quite significant to especially the offshore iteration of the Royal Oak. But these limited editions are actually not limited to that particular case shape, to that particular design, to that specific style. So as we progress, as we talk about some of these limited editions, I'll show you some of the more unusual pieces, some of the other designs and styles that were produced in collaboration with Arnold Schwarzenegger, whose career is really hard to distill into a simple catchphrase or word. Let's take a look at what really inspired this particular episode, what was at the origin. Most of you would remember that the Royal Oak Offshore, as a modulation, as a reiteration of the Royal Oak, was launched in 1993. So it celebrated its 30th anniversary last year. And to celebrate this anniversary, AP actually looked back to their storied collaboration with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which was really important in not only solidifying the existence of this particular model line, Royal Oak Offshore, but also in so many ways to the mainstreaming of the brand at large. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well as we talk about watches when the occasion comes. But this was a 500-piece limited edition that AP launched last year of the Royal Oak Offshore South-Winding Chronograph, as they call it, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the collection, but also the collaboration that they did, their first with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which was the inspiration of this particular piece, both in terms of the color scheme and also, of course, in relation to the collaboration. The 2023 limited edition, which was a run of 500 pieces, was rendered in black ceramic, which kept quite close to the aesthetic cues of the original, but actually changed a few things, of course. What really distinguished the End of Days was the specific case shape. Of course, it's blacked out aesthetic, but also the color scheme that was perhaps even heightened in the original version by the oversized Arabic numerals. Of course, there are a few differences you will probably immediately notice, even unconsciously, The 2023 edition sticks close to the current contemporary aesthetic of Royal Oak and Royal Oak offshore watches that are paired with straps. So there are those interlinks that join the case with the strap, whereas the older style of the case was more similar to that first reference, which was designed for the Royal Oak, the 14800, that was launched pretty much contemporaneously with the offshore line, and had this aesthetic where the strap feeds right into the case, which is a style of hooded lugs, so to speak. So that's the reference 25770 SN, the original. And we will go back to that reference, which is very iconic, quite fundamental. But perhaps even more importantly, it's where everything begins, right? You know, the beginning ends up being at the end, quite ironically there. However, the other way, you know, the other particular instance where this remake, this 2023 edition of the watch, of the End of Days, came up, of course, in the news when Arnold Schwarzenegger was detained in the Munich airport when he was taking an example of this watch to an auction. And that's also at the core of his relationship to the brand, which was solidified in the year 2000 Time to Give auction, which I will talk a little bit about in a moment. But within that 500 piece run, or perhaps in addition to it, I should say, there was also a 20 piece version of this new Royal Oak offshore, which has a custom rotor that has a likeness of Schwarzenegger in that classic Mr. Olympia pose. And it is, in fact, an oscillating weight, a rotor that is inscribed Arnold Classic. It's getting a little hot here, so I will take this jacket off. And this particular piece that belongs to that stricter, more limited edition of 20 pieces was, in fact, finally allowed to cross that border with the former governor of California paying the taxes for it in advance. And it was actually sold for about 300,000 US dollars, whereas the broader limited edition has its own, of course, desirability, so to speak. Thank you, Basil, by the way. I appreciate it. So we are, as per usual, getting a little bit of help from every watch. The new end of days has the serial number 26420 CE, since it is in ceramic. And even though it hasn't yet come up in public auction, it sold, it retailed at the price of 60,300 in US dollars. What about the 25,770? That, of course, sells for a much more modest amount, around 35,000, so to speak. This is a result from 2020. So perhaps it might not reflect the most current number in which they trade. This was also a 500-piece limited edition, and you can imagine that, especially with the recent release of a 2023 edition and with the extra light that was shown onto it on the 30th anniversary year last year of the offshore, it might appreciate yet further in the market. I think the more recent auction results kind of bears that out. In some ways, from the height of the market in June 2022 by Phillips New York, an example of this was sold for a whopping 94,500 US dollars. Yet that being said, more recently, in the December of last year, again in a Phillips New York auction, a similar example was sold for 25,400, falling quite a little bit short from the high end of the pre-auction estimate. I really like the aesthetic of the original piece. You know, I think it's partly the case design, partly the Arabic numbers. Of course, the new one has the appeal of a ceramic case, which, of course, when it comes to the realm of Audemars Piguet, is probably the most desirable material as we speak currently. You know, pink gold is always popular, of course. When it comes to the Royal Oak Jumbo especially, the stainless steel always holds its own, both in terms of the preference of collectors at retail, but also on the secondary market. Pink gold is always popular. But of course, ceramic is the hottest new thing when it comes to AP. So I can understand that the new 500-piece limited edition might be more desirable to some, but the slightly smaller case shape, the more, I guess, slightly outdated, but also quite charming 6-9-12 layout of the chronograph, the Arabic numerals, and of course, the fact that this is where it all started, I think makes this particular piece a very interesting limited edition for what we are talking about. And of course, this was the watch famously worn by Arnold Schwarzenegger on the set of the film End of Days. Now, when you look at this particular example, this is one of the 500-piece limited edition, right? When we bring our focus back to the example that was sold in June of 2022 at auction 6 by Phillips, Bach, et Rousseau, this is actually the prototype. You'll see that the numbers are a little bit thinner. The way that the hands are coded is a little bit different. And you will discover that lot 125 is actually accompanied by a letter that testifies to its unique provenance, because apparently after the filming was complete, Schwarzenegger surprised the producer for the Universal Studios, Bill Borden, with this gift, which was, after the fact, produced in a limited edition of 500 watches. So we quickly discover that the piece that was sold in June of 2022 by Phillips in New York was actually the original that was worn on the set by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So that explains the particular price for which it's sold, which I think is still an interesting price point for, again, a unique example of a foundational limited edition, a prototype that was actually worn on the set by Arnold and then gifted to the producer of the movie that gave its name to not one, but two limited edition runs of a Royal Offshore chronograph by Audemars Piguet. Now, perhaps the most memorable watch that marks this collaboration, that I've also used in my thumbnail for this show, is the Terminator 3. It's the T3 Royal Oak Offshore, which is incredibly oversized, of course, and perhaps reflects both Arnold's own propensities, his own preferences in terms of bigger watches, but also in so many ways the spirit of its time as well. Here's an example of that watch. This is the 25 863 Ti. It's a humongous piece made in titanium, 48.5 millimeters in diameter. And in 100 examples. It famously appears in Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, when the Terminator actually coordinates his time with that of the world and era in which he lands. And you can see how the aesthetic of the End of Days collaboration, the original 1999 one, is also reflected here, both in the fact that this is a chronograph. It features the oversized Arabic numerals on the dial, which, at least at the time, was Arnold Schwarzenegger's preference. And once again, it features, you might say, some kind of material innovation as well. Titanium, of course, is nowadays all the rage, but its use in luxury sports watches at the time was not as widespread, was not as ubiquitous as it is now, as we know it today. So this unique oversized design also in a way justifies it, in a way calls for it, asks for it. And this particular example, which was sold in Hong Kong by Philips, in September of 2023. Actually hammered at 190,500 in Hong Kong dollars. Which is a little more, or right around 24,300 in US dollars. Marked on the case back with the logo of the movie, in addition to, of course, the Royal Oak Offshore branding, and as a limited edition. And you can see the style still with that sort of hooded lug form rather than with the jointure of the interlinks that we are familiar with on the Royal Oak bracelets that connect the case to the strap that is used in the particular edition. Of course, a lot of times the presentation boxes are just as exciting and unique in this sort of collaboration, and it is absolutely worth, I think, to go after full sets, or as close as you can get to a full set when it comes to these sorts of pieces, these sorts of watches. Now I want to turn back the clock a little bit. We went to year 2003 with this watch, with the T3, with the 25863 Ti. But the event that perhaps entirely solidified the collaboration of the brand Audemars Piguet and Arnold Schwarzenegger was an auction, a charity auction that AP organized at the turn of the millennium in New York City. This was actually organized, the auction was held by Christie's in New York. It was on October 23rd, and part of the 125th anniversary of AP as a brand as well. It was part of the world tour, an exhibition that celebrated this momentous mark in AP's history. And for the event, and the previous CEO of AP talks quite a bit about this event in some of the interviews that he gave on the occasion of Royal Oak Offshore's 30th anniversary. It's an event where Schwarzenegger actually interfaced basically with a number of different celebrities who have been basically paired with specific AP watches for this event, and those watches were then sold in auction, and at the time it totaled a quite significant amount, which was $1.5 million, and that was donated to two foundations, basically, that both have a focus in giving to underprivileged youth, and that was Arnold Schwarzenegger's own Inner City Games Foundation and to the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville, Kentucky. The people who attended the charity event read like, the list reads like really who is who of the time, from Giorgio Armani to Mariah Carey to Cher to George Clooney, Billy Crystal, Whoopi Goldberg, Goldie Hawn, Evander Holyfield, Anthony Hopkins, Susan Sarandon, Sophia Loren, Shaquille O'Neal, of course, who would himself collaborate with the brands, Martin Sheen, Sharon Stone, Uma Thurman, Robin Williams, so on and so forth. But of course, perhaps the most important figure that Schwarzenegger was able to recruit for this auction was Ali, who, of course, happens to be one of his own idols as well. So maybe that's a moment where I can ask you to hit the like button, because it does always help, especially a channel with this kind of profile. And I think this is a good moment where we can go to a very unique watch that was first auctioned off in one of these Time to Give charity auctions, and it's a pièce unique. It's a unique example of a Royal Oak perpetual calendar that was sold in the auction that we just mentioned as Schwarzenegger's watch. I have to say, I completely adore the two-tone execution to begin with. You guys know that this kind of color scheme is very AP, especially for the 90s. And remember, this is 2000, so we are still kind of in the long 90s, so to speak. They usually do this in combining tantalum and pink gold. In this case, you have a Royal Oak perpetual calendar that combines titanium with pink gold, but that gunmetal gray tint is, I think, very suggestively rendered and given by the titanium here as well. The piece features a titanium case, a pink gold octagonal bezel, of course, held in place as per usual with hexagonal bolts in white gold. The tapering interlinks of the bracelet are also rendered in 18 karat pink gold. And the piece also features salmon, pardon me, salmon dial with the tapestry pattern. You guys know usually AP Grand Complication or Grand Complication watches are a lesson in everything but the kitchen sink. In this case, the piece combines not only a perpetual calendar and a chronograph, but also a minute repeater. It is inscribed on the case back as a one-of-a-kind watch produced for the 125th anniversary of Audemars Piguet. The caliber is beautifully presented through an exhibition case back, which is somewhat obscured with Arnold Schwarzenegger's signature, but that is the charm of this particular piece that also marks the historic occasion of that time to give auction. There's also a lovely hand engraved and skeletonized oscillating weight in gold that puts the initial logo of AP in sharp relief. Start, stop, reset, split seconds button integrated onto the crown. And I believe there's a slider here, there's a slide rather, that activates the chiming functions of the watch as well. I really like the fact that the moon phase indicator is actually at 12 o'clock, which kind of gives it the pride of place and the visual focus on the dial of the watch. I like the fact that the weekly calendar is integrated into that subdial, right? Hence the 52 that is indicated with a hand there. The date is within the continuous running seconds at 9 o'clock. That's a pointer date. The months are at 6 o'clock, encircling the leap year indicator, and the 30-minute totalizer at 3 o'clock surrounds the indicator for the day of the week. And all of these subdials are subtly sunk into the dial and framed with polished white gold rings, which again, I think really balance this play of different shades and colors of gray and pink, both on the dial of the watch and on the case and the bracelet as well. This piece was sold later by Antiquorum in New York on June 8th, 2011. And it hammered for a princely sum of $374,500 in US dollars. This was indeed the watch that was auctioned off as a pièce unique in 2000 for the 125th anniversary of AP and as part of the inaugural Time to Give charity auction, and it was the example that bore Arnold Schwarzenegger's signature. So we weren't limited only to Royal Oak Offshores, as you see when it comes to Arnold's own legacy. Of course, again, we have the original end of days chronograph, Royal Oak Offshore. We have the T3 piece, that oversized hunk of titanium. That's once again a Royal Oak Offshore chronograph, but in a measure, in a proportion that the world has rarely seen. Here are a few other examples of that particular watch, by the way. We had looked at the black dial version, so let's take a look at an early enough sale on public auction of a silver dial, opaline white dial version, which is quite nice in and of itself. This was actually an example that was sold by Antiquorum in year 2006, but in fact it doesn't belong to the limited edition properly, because this was made as a personal piece, as a piece for Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it was sold in April 2nd of 2006 by Antiquorum Geneva. The pre-auction estimate was set in the range between 30,000 to 40,000 in Swiss francs, and this watch hammered at 42,480 in Swiss francs as lot 478. Again, quite interesting when you examine the history of these things, the kinds of unique examples and special things done at the prototyping stage or later for the person who is involved in the collaboration. And the watch, of course, looks, I think, quite stunning in this more monochromatic expression as well. Now, again, going for some of the other interesting examples of collaborations with Arnold Schwarzenegger. We have another Royal Oak offshore chronograph. That was made in a limited run. And this is very similar in its aesthetic to the T3 watch. Because it features, again, the oversized 48 millimeter case. I believe it was made in 350 examples. This is the reference 26158 OR. And it has basically two instances of a recent sale on public auction. So it's good to enter the conversation here. They both sold right around 50,000, most recently by Christie's in an online auction based in Dubai on October 26th of 2021. Here's the piece. Again, very much in that aesthetic that characterizes, in terms of how the dial looks, the original end of days piece. In terms of the case design, also harkens back to that original 1999 collaboration as a rendering of the Royal Oak offshore chronograph with Arabic numerals on the dial and the classic 6-9-12 layout of the chronograph registers that are counterposed by a magnified date indicator at 3 o'clock. But this particular reference actually, in terms of its proportions, in terms of its case size, in terms of the diameter, is much more like the later Terminator 3 watch. And it's, again, dedicated to one of Arnold's charities and stamped accordingly on the case back. It's Arnold's All-Stars After School Adventures. Around 48 millimeters hunk of pink gold in the form of a Royal Oak offshore chronograph, which was sold right around $50,000, and more specifically for $47,500 in US dollars on October 27th by Christie's in an online auction based out of Dubai. That was the reference 26158 OR. For something that is in a similar genre, but perhaps more, how shall we put it, more humble, more restricted in size. We can go back to 2600BA. This was once again a limited edition piece that was produced around year 2003. You can see it was the ties between Schwarzenegger and the brand were quite tight at the time. This is a piece that was rendered in yellow gold, a kind of chocolate dial. And even from the dial layout, you can see that this is a watch in smaller diameter, still with oversized Arabic numerals, which are cut out when it clashes with chronograph registers, and in fact are completely left out at 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 3 o'clock. Of course, the watch features the exposed gasket between the octagonal bezel and the case in rubber, and those rubber details are carried over also to the chronograph pushers, as well as the hexagonal crown. Once again, the watch features on the case back an engraved signature of Schwarzenegger himself, and that topical, that characteristic kissing double AP initial clasp. That was very much of the time and was actually designed by the same person, Emmanuel Guet, who was behind the iteration Royal Oak Offshore from Jara Janta's original design. This was an example that sold out of Sotheby's, London, for 40,320 in British pounds. Now, I have said that these pieces were not always Royal Oak Offshores, were not always Royal Oak Offshore chronographs, but I do want to discuss one more Royal Oak Offshore chronograph that came out of this collaboration between Arnold and the brand. This is a piece that's known as the Legacy. Again, a very oversized case. But it's helpfully and interestingly also features a very interesting aesthetic that once again seems to be before its time or beyond its time. This is a piece that combines black ceramic, titanium, and pink gold, as you can observe. And in many ways, it seems to take what is best of a lot of the collaborations between Arnold and the brands around this time or until this time. I believe this particular edition came out around 2011, 2012. And it was limited to 1,500 pieces. A case that combines black ceramic with titanium and pink gold details, a pink gold chapter ring, oversized Arabic numerals in that same shade over a black mega tapisserie dial, a magnified date indicator at 3 o'clock, a 30-minute totalizer at 9 o'clock, continuous running seconds at 12 o'clock, and a 12-hour counter at 6 o'clock. All of these are also framed by pink gold rings. The chronograph hands provide a nice red accent, and the centrally deployed chronograph seconds hand also has a red tip, which coordinates with that. This particular example was sold for a little more than 40,000 in US dollars. As you can see, the case and the octagonal bezel, by and large, is in black ceramic, but there are titanium and pink gold accents, which includes the case back as well. And this other example, all the way back from 2016, was sold for 31,250 by Christie's in New York on October 19th, 2016. Pardon me, actually in Dubai, not New York. I think there was also a yellow gold encased variation of this reference, 26378, which might be worth checking out. This is also known as the Royal Oak Offshore Arnold Schwarzenegger The Legacy. Now, quite early on, AP had collaborations with Arnold that were not Royal Oak Offshores. And in fact, were in model lines that don't even exist in our day, that have now been effectively discontinued. Here's an example of that early collaboration, which has a tie-in to another movie. You can see some of the elements that connect this watch to the larger aesthetic that was Arnold preference at the time. The oversized Arabic numerals, of course, and here the khaki green dial accentuates that perhaps quasi-military field watch aesthetic. This was produced again around year 2000 in connection with Arnold's movie at the time, The Sixth Day. It's a Jules Audemars chronograph. Of course, a self-winding chronograph. It's a rather oversized version of the Jules Audemars at 48 millimeters. The reference number is 25949. And I believe in addition to this particular configuration, which features that quasi-militaristic aesthetic that combines a khaki green dial, oversized Arabic numerals with the black chronograph registers. There was also a Panda version, if I'm not mistaken, with a white dial in the backdrop and black chronograph registers. I don't exactly know whether that was a separate limited edition. I mean, whether that was another 50 units or whether that belonged to the 50-piece limited run around year 2000. But there we are. The reference number here is 25949. I believe in this case, the polished bezel was actually in platinum as well, which is an interesting accent and a very muted but noticeable contrast with what is otherwise a titanium case. As I mentioned, there was more to come from this collaboration, or rather, it was not limited to several variations of the Royal Oak offshore chronograph, or even to chronograph watches, such as the one that we have examined here in terms of an oversized Jules Audemars chronograph. There was also a dual time watch, which was actually severely limited in number, and supposedly it was only sold by invitation when it was released for around 45,000 US dollars, only made in 25 pieces. And I was able to find a couple of different sales of this watch, or an example of this watch from the past years, from across a few years, and I will share that with you now. This is a reference called 26085. It's once again a Jules Audemars piece in a dual time execution this time, 44 millimeters in diameter and in stainless steel. It features an asymmetric dial, which has a deep blue guilloche decoration, Roman numerals on a radially brushed hour track. Those numerals themselves coordinate with the color of the dial. There's a separate subdial to track a second time zone at 6 o'clock, which overlaps with a day-night indicator, a pointer date at around 2:30, and a fan-like scale for a power reserve indicator that centers right around 10 o'clock as well. This is an example that was sold in Hong Kong in 2015. by Antiquorum, and it was at the time roughly around 116,250, which is a little more than 15,000 US dollars at the time. Once again, this was a limited edition of 25 pieces, apparently sold invitation only at the time. In stainless steel, dual timepiece in a 44 millimeter Jules Audemars case. Retailed for around 43,000 US dollars. This example sells in 2015 for around 15,000 by Antiquorum, Hong Kong. And there's an earlier Antiquorum New York sale in 2011 of this same model, which is a very handsome looking watch. And again, I think an interesting limited edition that is connected to Arnold Schwarzenegger's legacy of charity, of his collaboration with Audemars Piguet, but offers a very different flavor to various iterations of the Royal Oak offshore chronograph, which have predictably, reasonably, understandably dominated his collaborations. This was from June 8th, 2011, Antiquorum New York, lot 350, which sold for 23,750. Governor's dual time watch, a Jules Audemars piece, 44 millimeters in stainless steel. Now it turns out, in addition to this piece, there is proof, there is reason to believe that the governor was a fan of the Jules Audemars case as a design, because we have seen the chronograph in oversized form for the 6th day. We have seen this dual timepiece. But there's also an equation of time perpetual calendar chrono a perpetual calendar chrono that was 100 pieces in pink gold. And here is that piece. As you can see, it features, once again, that more classically and conservatively inspired case Jules Audemars, long discontinued, long removed from AP's offerings. The reference number here is 26094 OR for pink gold. And the case is a 43 millimeter case. Once again, connected with Arnold's All-Stars After School Adventures. Once again, dedicated to his charity activities, giving opportunities to underprivileged children. This watch was also featured in white gold, of which I was able to find an example that was sold a couple of years back. But here's the pink gold example that was sold on October 25th, 2015 by Antiquorum in Hong Kong. It was lot 256 of that auction, and it sold for 337,500 in Hong Kong dollars, which I believe should be somewhere around $45,000 at the time. I was able to find the white gold example in an auction that sold in 2021 in Geneva on May 12th. Sotheby's Geneva. Lot 550 of that auction. Again, a perpetual calendar chronograph with that 6-9-12 layout for the chronograph registers, which are encircled by the day of the week at 6 o'clock, by the month at 9 o'clock, and a pointer date at 12 o'clock. There's a moon phase indicator at 3 o'clock as well. The dial for the white gold version has a beautiful champagne-like tint. .43 millimeters, so quite modern in its sizing, but not impossibly oversized. Here with its presentation box. This example in white gold sold for 32,760. Now, there's an example of this which was offered up for auction in 2013 that I believe could be a unique version made for Arnold himself, although I had no sure way of confirming this. But this is the only stainless steel version of that same watch, of the perpetual calendar chronograph Jules Audemars, that I was able to come across. It features that navy dial that we saw in the dual time watch that we just presented, that Jules Audemars dual time watch that was an invitation only. So if this wasn't a one-of-a-kind piece, It may have been in the same way that dual-time stainless steel Jules Audemars was, in the same way that reference 26085 ST was. This 26087 ST may have been, again, an invitation-only piece, very limited in number, maybe just like 20 pieces as the dual-time watch, because the presentation case is also different here, as you can see. With a plaque that mentions the Honorable Governor of the state of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger. This was a piece that's offered up for sale more than a decade ago now by Antiquorum New York on September 18th, 2013 as lot 456. And it is a Jules Audemars perpetual calendar chronograph in stainless steel with a navy blue guilloche decorated dial. And if it's not a unique example for the governor himself, it's certainly invitation only, limited run, much like the dual time watch, much like the 26085. This is 26087 ST. And it was, at that time, offered with a pre-auction estimate set within the range between 40,000 to 60,000 in US dollars. I believe it was not sold at the time. Because when I check things out on every watch, right, track previous auction results of this reference, it's almost entirely the pink gold versions. There's the white gold version that I just shared with you. No sight of any stainless steel version. In terms of past auction results, in terms of what is on the marketplace, it's the same thing. You can see white gold examples, pink gold examples, but never the stainless steel. So either it was a much more limited version than the 100-piece runs in pink gold and white gold, or in fact a unique piece that was made for the governor himself. I think going all the way back, I have to say the Grande Complication was my favorite watch that I had the pleasure of talking about today, that I had the privilege of presenting to you, of sharing with you. This was once again the piece that featured Arnold Schwarzenegger's signature for that inaugural Time to Give charity auction in year 2000, which also marked the 125th anniversary of the brand. It is a true grand complication when it comes to these kinds of pieces AP skimps out on nothing. They integrate a perpetual calendar with a split-second chronograph, and this is a chiming watch as well. So a true grand complication, not just an annual calendar or a perpetual calendar, not just a perpetual calendar chronograph either, but much, much more. A titanium case with pink gold accents, which I think just visually is a striking aesthetic. Must also be a pleasure to hear, because that's an interesting combination, even though the timbre of the sound probably takes much more after titanium, which is the main material of the case. And this piece that was originally part of that year 2000 auction was later sold by Antiquorum in New York again, a little more than a decade after the fact, on June 8th, 2011, as lot 351 for $374,500 in US dollars. Thank you again for tuning in tonight. This was the episode 6 of the RAAR series, References and Auction Results. I have chosen at iHeart Maldives, this is urging, to focus on Arnold Schwarzenegger's watches, specifically on his collaborations with Audemars Piguet that go all the way back to the end of days, to 1999, and tell a very important story in the mainstreaming of the brand itself, tells a very important part of the story in the history of the Royal Oak Offshore that now spans more than 3 decades, but includes so much more, as you have seen over the years. There have been many limited editions and extremely exclusive runs also of variations of the Jules Audemars, which is a much more conservative design and a line that no longer exists as part of AP's catalog. In terms of the collaborations with AP, there was a chronograph that was featured in that case that goes all the way back to year 2000 for the movie The Sixth Day. But there were also variations of the dual time and the perpetual calendar chronograph presented again in relatively oversized Jules Audemars cases as well. And of course, there was that pièce unique that was dedicated to 125th anniversary of the brand, and first auctioned off at the inaugural Time to Give in New York, the Grande Complication Royal Oak, executed in two-tone titanium with pink gold details and an exquisite salmon dial, just like my shirt. With that being said, thank you again. Please don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't. We're here with watch content every day. If you have any suggestions, if you have any recommendations for a future episode of the references and auction results, feel free to get in touch with me. Of course, you can do that in the comments. You can hit me up on IG, right here, should be right around here, at young.brando. I will respond almost immediately. If you want to support the channel, you know how, of course, YouTube offers a number of options, of which the monthly membership gives you access to an ever-growing archive of exclusive content. And of course, the video description gives you some further pointers if you do want to support the stream and what I try to do here, which is to build a community that comes together around knowledge of and passion for wristwatches. With that being said, I will bid adieu. See you in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, wear and enjoy your watches. Goodbye.